Miss Violette, I was asking you about whether or not being strangled and kicked and slapped, is that something that could be memorable to people based on your experience?
It would absolutely be memorable to people.
And so even if somebody doesn't write it down, you think it would be easy for someone to remember those things?
Yes.
We were talking about the rants and sustaining anger and a burst of anger. Remember those questions?
Yes.
And if we look at the May 26th text message, and this is Exhibit 450, even if we don't start way at the beginning, but if we start where there seems to be some anger noted, we're looking at the time at 4:03. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then we go through and there's some, this is where Mr. Alexander is going on and calling her names, things like that, right?
Correct.
And then we don't see an end to it until 9:17.
Yes.
So is that about 5 hours?
Yes, it is.
And even though there's not a message back and forth every minute in those 5 hours, is it important to you that Mr. Alexander was able to sustain his anger for that period of time?
Yes, it is.
And then after these text messages, to your knowledge, did they then jump on the computer and we're starting to write the instant messaging?
Yes.
And during the instant messaging is when even more of the character assassination occurs, right?
Correct.
And so is that important to you then that is this longer than a burst of anger?
It's longer than a burst of anger.
And do you consider this when you talk about escalation?
Yes, I do.
You asked a question about whether or not you were aware that Miss Arias threatened to expose Mr. Alexander for his pedophilic activity, right?
Correct.
And you said you were not aware of that?
No.
If you had learned about that during your assessment, would it be important for you to know that it was a one-time comment over the phone?
Yes.
And that there was no other times when she ever threatened to do that?
Yes.
And is it important for you to know that it was something that Miss Arias believed to be truthful, that it actually... Ms. Violette, with regard to this information, if it were true, did you see any other patterns of Jodi ever threatening Mr. Alexander with putting forth information?
No, I did not.
Did you ever see any patterns of her threatening him to expose him for his sexual activities?
No, I did not.
And other than her asking him to go to the bishop so they can discuss things, did you ever see her actually threatening that she would go without him?
No, I did not.
And to your knowledge, did Mr. Alexander refuse to go to the bishop?
Yes, he did.
What happens when, in an abusive relationship, what happens when one person, the abuser, is holding such secrets with the knowledge that his most intimate partner knows of these secrets? Does that cause any further issues with control and fear?
Yes, it does. I mean, that person knows the most about you, and they have the ability, if they chose, to expose who you are or what you've done to the people who mean the most to you and might hold your livelihood in their hands, and certainly your spiritual safety in their hands.
And so could Mr. Alexander feel the need to control Miss Arias regardless of whether or not she ever threatened to expose him?
He could.
You were asked the question of whether or not there was any other information that Mr. Alexander complained of anyone else being a stalker. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he had just said it to Miss Housley, right, on the instant messaging?
Correct.
And was it during that conversation, as you read that part of the conversation as a whole, was there smiley faces and ha-ha-has written in there as well?
Objection, lack of foundation as to the time when the statements were made.
During the same conversation, that's what I said.
Overall.
Yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Alexander kept Miss Arias away from his previous girlfriend, Deanna?
Yes.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Did you speak to Miss Arias about this?
Yes.
And based on that, are you aware that Mr. Alexander advised Miss Arias that Deanna was crazy?
Yes.
And did so in an effort to keep them separated?
Objection, state of mind.
Judge, may we approach? Ms. LaViolette, did you interpret the way that Mr. Alexander talked about Deanna to Jodi? Did you interpret that in a way to keep them separated?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
I did not necessarily interpret it one way or the other. I just saw that there was no contact between the two of them.
And who was preventing that contact?
Objection, lack of foundation.
She has the foundation.
Overruled.
I know that in one of the journal entries that Miss Arias dropped Mr. Alexander off and that Deanna was there and he didn't want, and she wasn't supposed to meet her. So the indication I have is that there was not an encouragement for them meeting, but I don't know how active his role was in doing that.
Okay. But it was Mr. Alexander who asked Jodi to not come in and drop him off.
Correct.
You were asked questions about Mr. Alexander's journals. Do you remember those?
Yes.
And whether or not he discussed the fact that he abused Jodi in those journals?
Yes.
And whether or not he included certain details about his life in those journals. Do you remember those?
Correct.
So, in the journals of Mr. Alexander that you read, did you ever see him discuss anything about taking a trip to Havasu Pai with Jodi?
I don't recall seeing that, no.
Did he write extensively about his activities with Jodi?
No, he did not.
Did he write about his tirades that he had with Jodi?
No, he did not.
Did he write about the character assassination and name-calling that he did to Jodi?
No, he did not.
And ultimately, in reading the instant messages between the two of them, are you aware that these things actually happened?
Yes, they did.
But they were not contained in his journal?
Correct.
When you were interviewing with Miss Arias, you were asked questions about whether or not you suggested answers to her. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you think that your assessment is based off of some false information then because you were somehow able to give her the right answers to give you?
No, I don't.
Why not?
Because I ask pretty open-ended questions. They're the kinds of questions I ask when I'm doing an assessment with my clients, and I try to leave them pretty open-ended. I ask things like, do you like your parents or do you like your partner? And it's not, people will say, well, I love my parents and I love my partner. And I say, no, I ask if you like them. Are they your friend? I want to know sort of the status of the relationship, how each person sees it. Do they believe they can trust the other person? So I try to ask open-ended questions. It doesn't mean I always succeed.
Okay. Well, specifically with the question that you might have asked about whether or not she used sex to quell his anger.
Yes.
At that point in time, had you already been speaking with Jodi for quite a while?
Yes.
And so had she already given you scenarios about when they would have sex or have sexual contact, things like that?
Yes.
And so at that point in time, did you already have a background and understanding of what was happening between the two of them?
Yes.
You were asked questions about whether or not you've ever testified or worked for, had a male client, right?
Yes.
And besides just criminal, because you, in forensic work, you don't just keep it to criminal, right?
No, I do more family law cases than criminal cases.
Okay. And in family law cases, have you been hired or retained by a man?
Yes, I have.
And have you been able to testify for them? Did you have any problems being retained by a man?
I don't have a problem being retained by a man. I do the same thing with a man that I do with a woman. I look at...
Objection, the other side.
Sustained.
Do you do the same thing with if you're hired by a man or a woman?
Yes, I do the same thing.
How do you do that?
I look at collateral data. I look at what evidence I have to support, any conclusions I'm going to make when I testify. I can still change my mind through the case, which I've done. When I've had the opportunity, I've interviewed lots of people in person or over the phone.
Beyond scope.
She's still explaining.
Overruled.
And I have advised attorneys to settle cases where I feel that they don't have.
Objection, beyond scope.
Sustained.
And have you advised in taking cases? Have you ever had opportunity where you felt that it would not be best for you to testify?
Yes, I have.
And in those situations, do you advise attorneys that maybe they ought to settle the case?
Yes.
You were asked a question in particular about who was the perpetrator of the greater domestic violence. And I think it goes to the fact that we have this physical violence and emotional and psychological abuse on one side from Mr. Alexander to Jodi, and then we obviously have what happened on June 4th, right?
Objection, the proper question. I think.
I don't know what.
Overruled.
You had answered, you had answered no to the question of whether or not Jodi was the greater perpetrator.
Yes.
Why?
Because the domestic violence was prior to June 4th. The defensive episode was on June 4th. And so when I look at something as potentially self-defense, I would see that as, it's certainly violence. There's no hiding that it's not only violence, it's a lot of violence. When someone is acting to defend their lives, I think they do whatever they need to do, and I think at some point may do more than they need to do.
Do you, in your experience, in order for there to be a domestically violent relationship, must there also be physical abuse?
No.
And if there, you were asked a question if you were to assume that there was no physical abuse in this case, does that change the ultimate opinion with regard to their relationship?
No, it does not.
Why not?
Because psychological abuse, and it's being recognized now. There are books written on it now that are starting to look at verbal abuse, emotional abuse, coercive controlling behavior. Those books are being written now because of the testimonies of people who are on the other end of those kinds of abuse and the sort of apprehension that can develop with no physical violence. I've worked with people who come into my office and they're shaking and they're withdrawn and they're depressed and they feel powerless, and there has been no physical violence. There's simply been manipulation, control, put downs, character assassinations, great power differences, and the person wanting to be in that relationship has slowly sunk. It's not something that happens all at once. It's gradual, and oftentimes people don't see what's happening to them until it's happened.
And so in this case, given what you have to work with in this case, did you have enough to make that call? if you didn't have the physical violence?
If I didn't have enough to make the call, I wouldn't be sitting here.
All right. You were asked questions about, well, in one of the response to the questions, you talked about that the battered woman doesn't need to be perfect, that the battered women often have faults associated with them as well, right?
Correct.
And what does that mean to you with regard to working with battered women?
That there may be people who are victims or survivors of domestic violence, male or female, that I don't particularly like, or I don't particularly feel have done good things, or I feel that they need a lot of help themselves. You know, maybe they need their own mental health have their own mental health issues. Maybe they have, maybe it's situational. Maybe it's just on account of the relationship that they've been in. Maybe they do things I don't like. Maybe they have habits I don't like. But it doesn't mean they're not abused. So I don't see it as just a cause and effect situation. I think any of us can get upset. For instance, if we were with someone who was addicted. People who live with addicts get upset. They get upset at that addict. Now, do they have the right to beat and on that addict or belittle them and whatever? Now, that's why people go to Al-Anon, so that they learn how to deal with that. And I think in this case, it would have been terrific if there had been help.
Some type of intervention.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, then, when you work with abusers and in your men's groups, do you, because of what they have done and why they're in the group, are you still able to get along with them and work with them?
I like almost everybody who's ever been in my men's group over the last 34 years. There's probably about 3 or 4 people I haven't liked, and that's why I have a co-facilitator, because hopefully one of us is going to like them. And but they're so multidimensional. They're not one-dimensional people. They have lots of very likable qualities, as do survivors of abuse, have many likable qualities. Nobody's one-dimensional.
And so would it be unfair then to characterize an abuser as purely evil?
It would be totally unfair.
And so when we're talking about Mr. Alexander, is it possible then that he had lots of likable qualities?
I think he did. I think from the things I read that he had really wonderful qualities, that he was able to motivate people, I think is pretty neat. I think that he had, I remember Miss Arias.
Sustained.
I didn't ask this question. Pardon? I didn't ask this question. I didn't ask. It's not a sec. May we approach?
May continue.
Ms. LaViolette, the fact that Mr. Alexander had all these wonderful qualities, does that necessarily mean that it wouldn't be possible for him to be an abuser?
No, not at all.
You were asked a question about a text message between the two of them where Mr. Alexander tells Ms. Arias to empty out her voicemail, right?
Correct.
And that in your understanding, it seemed as though it was an order to her.
Yes.
But that text message alone, does that mean much to you in your overall assessment?
No, it didn't.
You were asked a question about when Miss Arias was being strangled and the fact that she didn't fight back, right?
Correct.
And in your experience with other women or men, in your experience, do people who have been battered, do they have a tendency to still not want to hurt their partner?
Yes, they oftentimes don't believe they're really going to be hurt, and they know they're going to have to hurt back, and they don't want to do it. And sometimes it goes too far, and they have not fought back. But eventually, most people do fight back.
You were asked about this being a love-hate relationship, and you put it, and you talked to us about characterizing love-hate relationships more in a high conflict type relationship.
Yeah.
Why is the relationship between Mr. Alexander and Jodi not high conflict?
It's not high conflict because of the abusive dynamics. High conflict really looks at people who may not like each other in a relationship, may talk disrespectfully to each other in a relationship, may have occasional physical kinds of things, but they're basically both, they've got pretty much equal power, and there's no fear in that relationship, and it's not considered a healthy relationship, but it doesn't have all the characteristics of abuse.
You were asked a question about whether or not Ms. Arias could be the perpetrator in this case. In other words, if she was the perpetrator of domestic violence for the 2 years that they were together, or under 2 years that they were together, right?
Correct.
And do you think that's true? Do you think that?
That she's the perpetrator?
Yes.
No, I don't.
And you were not privy to, there's no other recorded phone calls other than the phone sex tape, is that right?
Correct.
And so, not being privy to listening to how they interacted on the phone, would you expect that Ms. Arias could be psychologically and emotionally abusive to Mr. Alexander over the phone, but then not see evidence of that in their text messages and instant messages?
No, I would expect to see that in their communication style, that there would be sort of a pattern with both of them that would be abusive.
Okay, so when you're talking about patterns, if there's a pattern in their written communication, instant messaging and text messaging, of Mr. Alexander being abusive versus, and watching Miss Arias try and talk him down and apologize, things like that, would you expect that a similar or the same type of pattern then in their phone conversations?
I would expect that. I don't have the phone conversations, so.
Okay, but just that you would expect it?
Yes.
Okay. You told us that you reviewed 7 hours of unedited footage, and these are some of which included interviews of Mr. Alexander's family. Is that right?
Correct.
And is that the only access you were allowed to have to Mr. Alexander's family?
Objection.
Yeah.
Foundation.
Approach.
You were asked the question about whether or not it was common, and to your knowledge, for a battered woman to snap. Do you remember that question?
Yes.
And do women living in abusive relationships, do they ever reach a point where they become aggressive, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Do victims of crime and victims of domestic violence, do they reach a point of anger?
Anger is sort of a byproduct of being victimized. If you're robbed, if you're mugged, if somebody breaks into your home, most people get angry, and that is true of any victim, including victims of domestic violence.
What happens when we're talking about domestic violence if somebody is angry as well as afraid?
If you are angry and afraid, there is more likelihood that you would overreact.
All right.
Objection by foundation.
All right. Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Mr. Martinez, you may follow up.
Ma'am, one of the things that the jury asked you about was how many times you had testified in a criminal court on behalf of men. Do you remember that question being asked of you?
Yes.
And you said 1 or 2 times, right?
Yes.
What are the names of the 2 men that you testified for in a criminal proceeding?
Objection, Relevance.
Ruled.
I testified. I don't know their names, and that's confidential, I believe. But
Well, hold on. Let me do. Do you think the name that you testified on behalf of Ms. Arias, do you think that that's confidential?
No.
So these cases involving these men that you testified for, and it's only criminal cases that I'm asking about. Do you understand that?
Yes,
Family violence cases, correct? Do you understand that?
yes,
I'm only asking about criminal cases where there is a charge pending against somebody, a man, and you testified against that man. On behalf of the man.
I don't know his name. It was a long time ago. He was a police officer, and as it
So,
turned
do you know
out...
his name? Yes or no?
No, I don't know his
So
name.
there's no way for us to check that out, is there, without the name?
No, I don't write the names of people on my CV.
With regard to that one time, was there another time that you testified? And what was the charge against that individual?
The charge against him was domestic violence.
And are you sure it was in criminal court?
Can I explain it?
No, I'm asking whether or not you're sure that the charge against that individual was in criminal court or somewhere else. For example, an administrative hearing.
It was an appeal on a criminal case.
And it was you're saying it was in criminal court, or was it as part of his job duties?
Overruled. It wasn't, are you talking about a Board of Rights? I did that.
I'm asking, you know what a criminal court is, correct?
Yes, I'm trying to answer you.
And I'm asking whether or not that case involving that individual was in criminal court, yes or no? Do you know?
It was in criminal court, and I wrote a report. I didn't actually testify.
Right, that's the point that I'm trying to get across. You were asked by the jurors how many times you had testified on behalf of a man in criminal court. Do you remember that question?
Yes, I do. Overruled.
And you remember that you said 1 or 2 times, right? Well, you told us about this individual that we've just been talking about, this police officer. You did not testify in front of a criminal court, did you?
No, I didn't.
So you misrepresented something to the jury, didn't you?
Objection, mischaracterizes her testimony.
I was
Yes or no?
I did not testify. I wrote a report in his behalf to go to criminal court.
That's different than testifying in court, isn't it?
Yes, it's different than testifying in
That's
court.
the one time. How about the other time? Give me the name of the other individual.
I said once or twice. That maybe I don't have my CV in front of me. I have 60 cases. What I wrote down was how many times I've testified, period. Then I wrote the numbers of civil cases or family law cases and the number of criminal cases. I don't know the names of everybody because that spans over 29 years.
Your CV doesn't include, you said, I don't have my CV in front of me, so I can't tell you the other case that I testified to in criminal court. Your CV does not include the times that you testified in criminal court. Does it? Specifically, it doesn't, does it?
Yes, it says testified in different times.
It says you testified at different times, but it doesn't identify the cases specifically, does it?
I don't write the names of the people down, if that's what you're asking.
With regard to the other, there was no second individual that you testified, and I'm talking about men. There was no second man that you testified in criminal court on his behalf. Isn't that true?
I said 1 or 2 because I don't remember, Mr. Martinez.
Right. So assuming you don't remember, the question was, by the jury, how many times did you testify on behalf of a man in criminal court? The answer is either 0 or you don't know, correct?
1 written report that I'm sure of. And I was willing to testify, and I was not asked to testify. I wrote a report.
And that means you did not testify if you just wrote the report, correct?
Correct.
You were asked also about the defendant and whether or not she was manipulative. Do you remember being asked those questions?
Yes,
by the jury?
Yes, I do.
And one of the things that you said, well, what you told them was what she does when she's a juvenile. Well, I don't see that as something that carries on to being manipulative later on in life, right?
No, I didn't say that.
Well, didn't you testify about whether or not she was manipulative as a teenager in response to that question?
I said I didn't know if she was manipulative as a teenager, I believe, and I said that there's a lot of difference between how teenagers are and how adults are. So if there was a pattern of manipulation, and that's what I talked about, Mr. Martinez, I didn't see the pattern.
But the question was asked involving manipulation, and isn't it true, and the jurors asked this question today, isn't it true today in response to the question from the jurors, isn't it true that you started to discuss the defendant whether or not she was manipulative as a teenager? Do you remember that or not?
I remember that people asked me what my definition of manipulative was and if I could be wrong about it, and I said yes.
But it was before that. It was immediately or almost immediately after the question about whether or how many times you had testified in criminal court on behalf of men. It was immediately after that. Do you remember that? Does that...
Can you tell me the question specifically?
Ma'am, I'm asking what you remember. I'm not... This only happened just less than 2 hours ago, correct?
I was asked about manipulation, and I answered a question about manipulation.
I'm asking you about time. Let's focus on that. Isn't it true that we started approximately 9:30, correct?
Objection, relevance.
Correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure of your question, Mr. Martinez. I'm confused about what you're asking me.
My question is...
You may approach. You may continue.
Do you remember your responses that occurred between 9:30 in the morning and now?
Well, if I knew exactly what you were asking me, I would probably remember my responses.
I take it that you're saying that you need your recollection refreshed, right?
That would be great.
So what you're saying then, if you need your memory refreshed, is that you don't remember. That's what you're telling me then, right?
I don't know what your question is, Mr. Martinez. I'm confused about your question, and if I was clear about that, I might be able to answer it.
The question was you know that the jury asked you some questions today, correct?
Correct.
And one of those questions asked about whether or not the defendant was manipulative. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Mischaracterizes the entirety of the question.
Overruled.
And do you remember that in response to a question involving whether or not the defendant was manipulative, you answered that and referred to her during the time that she was a teenager as whether or not she was manipulative? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you said that, well, the information was received from somebody, and during that time, she may or may not have been manipulative depending on the way you look at the definition, right?
I'm not sure.
Okay, but you remember saying, at least, that if the defendant was manipulative when she was younger, whether it be around the teenage years or on the cusp of the teenage years, you indicated that, well, that manipulation may not carry over to an adult, right?
Correct.
And so based on that, you then told the jury that the defendant was not manipulative in your opinion, right?
Based on materials I'd read.
Absolutely. Based on the materials that you read, you indicated to the jury that it was your opinion that the defendant was not manipulative, correct, this morning?
Based on the materials I read, correct.
Based on the materials you read this morning, in response to a juror question, you said the defendant was not manipulative, correct?
That I didn't have evidence I said I had no evidence of Miss Arias being manipulative. That nothing that I re-evaluated or assessed indicated to me that she had a pattern of manipulation.
So in your view, you indicated that there was, what you said basically was that she had no pattern of manipulation, right? And you told us about this incident when she was younger, and you said specifically she may have been manipulative then, but not now, right?
I said there was no pattern of manipulation that I saw in the evidence that I read. That's what I said.
And with regard to that particular issue of manipulation, and in response to a juror's question, you did not reference the Purple Plum incident and the defendant's interaction with men, did you?
No, I did not.
And in fact, that was on June 13 of 2008, wasn't it?
Correct.
And there's at least an indication from you that you considered a manipulative incident during the teenage years and then on June 13 of 2008, to you, that does not establish a pattern, right?
There was a difference in behavior
Yes or no?
following the killing of Mr. Alexander, and there was one other incident that you referenced, Mr. Martinez, and an incident a decade apart from another incident following a trauma does not indicate a pattern. No, it does not.
But when you answered the questions to the jurors, you did not reference the Purple Plum incident, correct?
No, I didn't.
And ma'am, one of the other things that you told us was that, well, even if this incident involving the pedophilia, alleged pedophilia, did not occur, that would not change your opinion, then, right? As to whether or not the defendant was abused in this case, right?
Correct.
Ma'am, one of the things that I want you to consider is, and you were asked many questions about the defendant, whether or not she was telling the truth and whether or not she was lying, and you said, well, in my view, she may have been lying after this happened, but that in and of itself does not lead you to believe that she was being untruthful, such that your assessment was affected, right?
That's not what I said, Mr. Martinez.
Well, was your assessment negatively affected by the fact that she may have been untruthful after her killing of Mr. Alexander?
You're still mischaracterizing what I said.
I'm not asking you whether or not, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with the question. I'm asking you a question. And the question is, is your assessment still the same in light of the fact that the defendant made these lies after the killing of Mr. Alexander?
My assessment about domestic violence remains the same, Mr. Martinez.
And you said in part because you believe that those lies, when people are involved in these kind of circumstances, well, they have a tendency to make things up, right?
Objection is characterized the evidence beyond scope.
Overruled.
Right?
That when people go through an event that's abhorrent to them, that they are willing to lie about it, and there is self-protection in that, and that's a pretty human response.
Right, and that's what you said, and that's how you viewed the defendant's lies in this case, right?
I saw no pattern of lying.
I'm not asking you if you saw a pattern of lying. You just gave me a definition of what people do after an abhorrent event. I'm asking you if that is how you saw the defendant's lies in this case. Yes or no?
Yes.
And hypothetically speaking, would your opinion that she was somebody who suffered abuse, would it change, hypothetically speaking, if you found out that the defendant had lied as part of these proceedings? Would that change?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Objection is sustained.
Years later, ma'am, after this abhorrent event, this killing, what if it, hypothetically speaking, it came to your attention, maybe 2, 3, 4 years later, it came to your attention that the defendant had lied about some other event, about something else?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yes, you may approach.
Hypothetically speaking, if you found out the defendant 2 or 3 or 4 years later lied about something, whatever it may have been, now that it's removed, if you will, from the original lying about the abhorrent event, would that change your opinion would that change the assessment opinion that you rendered in this court?
It would depend on what the person lied about.
No, I'm asking about the defendant. I'm not asking about a person. I'm asking about
It would
the
depend on
defendant.
what Ms. Arias lied about. It would depend on, once again, I'm looking at a pattern. I look at patterns, Mr. Martinez. I don't look at 3 isolated instances. I look at patterns of behavior. So it would depend. I would take that into account, but I would also want to look at the quality of what you're talking about.
So
Because There's a little white lie, there's a big lie, there's a lie that affects, I mean, I don't know what kind of lie you're talking about.
So what you're saying to me is that to you, a lie really is not a lie, right?
Objection is characterized as arrest.
Testimony.
Overruled.
Right?
That's not what I'm saying at
What
all.
you're saying is that, well, if a person, it's a little white lie to you, that's no big deal, is what I hear you saying. Is that true?
That's not what I'm saying.
Well, isn't a white lie, a little white lie, the same thing as a big lie because they both involve misrepresentation? Isn't that true?
Overruled.
If I'm asked by someone I like if this makes them look fat and I say no, that's a little white lie.
Objection. There's an objection.
Objection, non-responsive.
All right, ask another question.
Ma'am, what you're saying is you not only are someone who can be somewhat of a lie detector, you're also saying that your experience goes even, or your assessments can be tainted by the fact that some lies you'll consider white lies, some are medium type lies, and some are very big lies, right?
Objection, compound question.
Overruled.
What I'm saying is there's a difference in lies, the quality of lies, and there's a difference in a pattern of lies, whether you characterize somebody as a liar or you characterize somebody as occasionally saying something that isn't the truth, which, by the way, most human beings have done. So I have to look at the context, Mr. Martinez. I'm not black and white. There's a whole lot of gray here.
I'm not asking you to characterize anybody as a liar, am I?
I'm not sure, Mr.
I'm
Martinez.
asking you to tell me what the effect, a lie 2 or 3 years later by the defendant, what that lie would have, if any, what impact it would have in your assessment in this case.
Objection already asked and answered.
Overruled.
I would consider what it was. I would consider the pattern. I would consider the quality. I would look at all kinds of things to see whether it affected my assessment of domestic violence occurring, because that's what I am here to do, to talk about domestic violence.
But in this case, isn't the claim of domestic violence only based on the defendant's statement?
No, not at all.
Well, if you looked at the journals, there is no indication whatsoever of domestic violence there, is there?
I didn't just look at the journals, Mr.
But
Martinez.
ma'am, I'm asking you about the journals specifically. Isn't it true that the journals don't include any indication of domestic violence, correct?
It alludes to cruel, harsh behavior.
Show me, if you can, point to me where it says in those journals, Mr. Alexander choked me.
Objection
There's
asked
no-
and answered.
Overruled.
Is there?
There's no specific allegations of domestic violence.
And so in this case, what you're telling us is that you're relying on the defendant's word, correct?
Objection
Incorrect.
asked and answered.
Incorrect.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
Your opinion, ma'am, in this case, really, if we look at it, is only as good as what you've sort of been telling us in this case, right?
I am unclear about what
Well,
you mean.
let's do it this way. Isn't it true that with regard to a juror question just now, you told the jury that you had testified on 1 or 2 occasions on behalf of a man? Do you remember telling us that?
Answered.
Sustained.
And, ma'am, afterwards, you indicated that, well, you didn't testify that you wrote a report, right?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
Judge, may we approach? You may approach.
You've indicated to the jury that you believe that the defendant, in this case, suffered abuse, correct?
Correct.
Is that certainty that the defendant suffered from abuse the same type of certainty that you gave the jury with regard to your question involving how many people, how many men you had testified to or testified on behalf in criminal cases? Is it the same kind of certainty?
Mr. Martinez,
Yes or no?
I testified for a man in family law. I am not.
Judge, non-responsive. Yes or no? Is it the same type of certainty for both of those answers?
Absolutely not.
So you're saying that with regard to telling this jury that you testified on behalf of men 1 or 2 times, with regard to that, did you not take that question seriously?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
I took that question seriously. I have had almost 29 years, and I could not remember, and I should have said, I don't remember, and I know I've testified for men in family law cases. But one report in a criminal case, but I don't remember because I don't have my CV in front of me.
Ma'am, isn't it true to say that you testified in a criminal case knowing that it was only a report? Isn't that at the base a misrepresentation
Objection asked
on your
and
part?
answered beyond the scope.
Overruled.
I do not remember if I testified. I thought I had testified in one. I said 1 or 2, and I still don't know that I haven't testified in one. But it's been 29 years, and I don't remember. So it would have been more accurate for me to say, I don't remember. I remember testifying for men in family law cases. I could say that.
I'm asking about the one where you said you were.
I think I've answered that many times, Mr. Martinez.
I'm asking about the question about the circumstance where you described yourself as testifying on behalf of a man when in fact you only wrote a report.
Objection asked and answered. This has been clarified.
Sustained.
The issues that are presented in this case, ma'am, you resolved them relying, if you will, in part on your education, correct?
Relying on my experience.
So your education played no part in responding to the questions that were posed by the jurors.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, you don't have a doctorate, correct?
Correct.
Objection beyond the scope.
Approach. Minute recess. Please be back in the designated area in 10 minutes. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.